Case Number 1. Michael Alig. He told people what he had done at parties, at clubs, in conversations with the journalists who were covering the downtown scene. He described the night in detail, the confrontation, the hammer, the Drano, the bathtub, the Hudson River, and the people who heard him laughed or rolled their eyes or assumed it was the kind of thing you said when your entire identity was built on being too much. Michael Alex spent months narrating a murder he had committed to the social world that had made him famous, and that world mostly treated it as performance. That was, after all, the world he had built, one where the line between confession and theater had been deliberately dissolved. Michael Alec was 28 years old in the spring of 1996. Through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, he had made himself the central organizing figure of New York City's underground club scene, promoting events at Limelight, Tunnel, and Club USA under club owner Peter Gatien. He was not merely a promoter, he was the curator of a social aesthetic. The Club Kids, a rotating cast of downtown figures who competed in elaborate costumes and staged personas, revolved around the events Alec organized. He appeared in mainstream magazines. He was referenced as a genuine tastemaker. By 1996, the cultural moment had not entirely passed, but Oleg himself had. His addiction to heroin and ketamine had grown severe enough that it dominated his daily life, and the financial deterioration that followed had left him indebted to multiple people, including someone he considered part of his inner circle. Andre Melendez was 25 years old. Known in the clubs as Angel, a name earned by the elaborate angel wing costumes he wore to parties where extraordinary presentation was the cost of entry, he was Colombian, undocumented, and supported himself as a drug dealer, operating within the same nightlife ecosystem that Alig had built. He sold drugs to people in the scene, including Alig, who owed him money for a transaction that had gone unpaid long enough to become a genuine dispute. By the early months of 1996, Melendez was done waiting. His family, including his sister Maria, remained in Colombia and were largely unaware of the world he had made for himself in New York. They would eventually spend years trying to secure recognition for what happened to him. On March 17, 1986, Melendez came to Alec's apartment at 300 West 45th Street to collect the debt. What followed in that apartment has been reconstructed through court documents, forensic evidence, and Alec's own subsequent narrations, which were consistent enough in their detail to be entered into the legal record. Alec's roommate Robert Riggs, known in the club scene as Freeze, struck Melendez with a hammer. Alec then suffocated Melendez with a plastic bag and injected Drano into his arm. The body was stored in the bathtub of the apartment for approximately 1 week. They then dismembered it, packed the remains in boxes, and disposed of them in the Hudson River. In the months that followed, Alec narrated what had happened. Journalist Michael Musto of the Village Voice was among those who documented his accounts. Club regulars heard the description at parties. Police received reports. The information was not initially treated as credible. Alec's established persona as a provocateur who trafficked in extreme statements made the confession read as theater, consistent with how he had always presented himself. That changed in October 1996, when a dismembered torso washed ashore on Staten Island. Forensic identification established that the remains belonged to Andre Melendez. The homicide investigation that followed was no longer a question of interpretation. The same accounts that had been dismissed as performance now constituted a detailed confession to a documented murder. On November 7, 1996, police arrested Michael Alig in a motel room in Charlotte, North Carolina. He had left New York. Robert Riggs was also taken into custody. Both were charged with second-degree murder. With the physical evidence, the forensic identification, and months of self-incriminating statements now in the investigative record, neither man went to trial. In early 1997, Alig pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. The parole board reviewed his case multiple times and denied release on each occasion, citing continued drug use within the institution and documented infractions across his years of incarceration. He was finally paroled in 2014, having served approximately 17 years. The years after his release carried a diminished public profile, but addiction did not release him. On December 26, 2020, Michael Alig died of an accidental heroin overdose in New York City. He was 54 years old. The case had been memorialized in Michael Musto's book Disco Bloodbath, published in 1999 and adapted into the 2003 film Party Monster, with Macaulay Culkin in the lead role. Andre Melendez was 25 years old when he entered that apartment to collect money he was owed and did not leave it. His disappearance was not initially taken seriously by official channels. He was undocumented. He moved in a world that operated outside ordinary social infrastructure, and the circumstances of his vanishing did not generate the kind of immediate institutional attention that might have accelerated the investigation. His sister Maria later worked to ensure that his name was part of the record of what happened, not merely a footnote in a story about the person who killed him. He has been gone for nearly 30 years. His story is still most often encountered inside accounts of the man who spent months telling everyone exactly what he had done, and whom no one believed, until a body made believing necessary. Case number 2. Stephen McDaniel. He was standing in front of a news camera on a residential sidewalk when the word came through. McDaniel had positioned himself among the gathered neighbors, classmates, acquaintances, people performing concern in the way people do when something has gone wrong in a building they share. He gave the reporter the expression you give when you are worried about someone you know. He said the things that are said in those circumstances. Then, in the middle of the interview, the reporter received a notification that police had found a body inside the complex. McDaniel's composure left his face in real time, on camera, in a manner that behavioral analysts have since characterized as involuntary. It was not a performance of shock or grief. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has just understood that a situation they believed they had controlled has come apart. He folded. The footage is a matter of public record and is cited regularly in behavioral analysis and law enforcement training as a documented instance of the precise moment a person realizes that concealment has ended. Stephen McDaniel was 25 years old. He had recently completed his law degree at Mercer University School of Law in Macon, Georgia, and was by every external measure a capable, if unremarkable, young professional, described by people who knew him as quiet and academically strong, but socially withdrawn in a pronounced way. He lived in the same apartment complex as Lauren Giddings. They were law school classmates. He had obtained access to a master key that permitted entry to the building's common areas. What police would recover from his digital devices in the course of the investigation revealed a more specific portrait. Investigators found deleted video files that showed McDaniel had filmed outside Giddings' apartment window, establishing a documented pattern of surveillance that had been ongoing for an undetermined period before her death. Lauren Giddings was 27 years old. She had graduated from Mercer Law and was in the final preparation period before sitting for the Georgia bar exam, the last formal step between the years of legal education she had completed and the career she intended to build. She lived next door to Stephen McDaniel in the residential building they had both occupied during law school. She had no documented awareness of his surveillance of her, and nothing in the records suggests she had any reason to regard him as a threat. In late June 2011, McDaniel used the master key to enter Giddings' apartment while she was asleep. He strangled her. He then dismembered her body in her bathtub using a hacksaw and transported her torso to a dumpster on the property of the apartment complex. He did not remove the hacksaw packaging from his own apartment, and the video files he had deleted from his camera were not deleted completely. On June 27, 2011, Giddings' sister contacted police after Giddings failed to respond to calls or answer her door. Officers located Giddings' torso in the complex dumpster within a short time of the missing person report. The investigation developed quickly and centered on McDaniel early. A search of his apartment produced the packaging from the hacksaw, an item that had no ordinary explanation, given that Giddings had been dismembered and that he shared a building with the dumpster where her torso was found. Digital forensics analysis then recovered the deleted footage from his camera, files that had been erased after the fact, recordings of Giddings' apartment window made during the hours immediately preceding her death, documenting a period of pre-crime surveillance. The files had been wiped from the device. They had not been wiped with enough thoroughness to prevent recovery by forensic tools. The combination of physical evidence from his apartment and the recovered digital record was sufficient to establish his involvement without requiring additional investigative steps. McDaniel was arrested in July 2011 on a charge of murder. He had stood in front of a news crew that same day presenting himself as a neighbor with no knowledge of what had happened. In March 2014, McDaniel entered a guilty plea to murder to avoid the death penalty. The prosecution had built its case around the recovered digital surveillance record, the hacksaw packaging recovered from his apartment, and the scope of documented prior conduct established through forensic examination of his devices. The weight of that evidence made a trial, in the defense's assessment, untenable. No jury heard the case. The guilty plea resolved it. He received a sentence of life in prison. In 2018, McDaniel filed a post-conviction appeal on the grounds that his constitutional rights had been violated during the interrogation that followed his arrest. The appeal was reviewed and denied by the Georgia courts. He remains incarcerated within the Georgia Department of Corrections. The specific facility where he is held has not been made available in public records. He is approximately 39 years old. The case appears regularly in digital forensics instruction as an example of the recovery of deliberately deleted media files as evidence, and the live broadcast moment from June 2011 appears in behavioral analysis contexts as a documented example of involuntary disclosure through physical response. Lauren Giddings was 27 years old, months away from the bar exam she had worked toward for years. She lived next door to the man who killed her, separated from him by a corridor and a door he had unauthorized access to open. That proximity, the mundane fact of sharing a building, was the specific structural condition that made what he did to her possible. She has been gone for more than a decade. She was about to begin. Case number 3. Liam McAtasney. The camera was hidden. The confession was not. In a recorded conversation arranged by a mutual friend who had contacted police, Liam McAtasney sat across from a man wearing a concealed recording device and described in unprompted detail what he had done to Sarah Stern. He covered the method. He noted, with apparent frustration, how long it had taken, approximately half an hour. He expressed disappointment about what the lockbox had actually contained when he opened it. The footage was later played in its entirety for a jury in Monmouth County, New Jersey, which heard McAtasney describe a murder in the language of someone who had processed it as a transaction that had not gone quite according to plan. The jury convicted him. Liam McAtasney was 19 years old, from Seagirt, New Jersey. He had no prior history of violent crime. He had no record that would have made him a visible candidate for what he did. What he had was a specific piece of information. His childhood friend Sarah Stern had recently learned that her deceased mother had left her a $10,000 inheritance and that the money was held in a lockbox inside her home. McAtasney knew about the inheritance. He knew about the lockbox. That knowledge, and what he decided to do with it, constituted the entirety of his motive. His roommate, Preston Taylor, was later implicated in the events that followed the murder itself. Sarah Stern was also 19 years old. She and McAtasney had grown up alongside each other in the same community, a friendship that began in childhood and had been maintained across the years without apparent disruption or conflict. When her mother died, Stern learned that a $10,000 inheritance had been left for her. It was a meaningful sum, particularly for a 19-year-old, and she had no particular reason to treat the information as sensitive. McAtasney was someone who had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. The trust she extended to him was proportional to what their relationship had always appeared to be. It was not a failure of judgment on her part. It was simply extended to someone who had already made a different set of calculations about what her life and her money were worth to him. On December 2nd, 2016, McAtasney strangled Sarah Stern inside her home in Manasquan, New Jersey. He then contacted Preston Taylor, and together they transported Stern's body to the Route 35 bridge over the Shark River Inlet in Belmar, New Jersey. They threw her over the railing. Stern's car was left near the bridge. The scene was designed to be read as a suicide. An abandoned vehicle on a bridge is a recognizable staging, and McAtasney's intention was for the investigation to end there without reaching him. The staging did not hold. A mutual friend, Anthony Curry, concluded that something was wrong and went to police. Curry agreed to meet with McAtasney while wearing a hidden recording device provided by investigators. In the conversation that followed, McAtasney provided a full account of what he had done to Sarah Stern, how he had strangled her, how long it had taken, and what the aftermath had looked like. He also disclosed with evident disappointment that when he opened the lockbox he had murdered Stern to access, it had contained $7,000, $3,000, less than the $10,000 he had been counting on. Both the operational description and the expression of financial disappointment were captured in full on the recording. McAtasney was arrested in February 2017. At trial in Monmouth County in 2019, the prosecution played the hidden camera footage for the jury. The defense had filed a pretrial challenge to the admissibility of the recording, arguing that its method of collection raised constitutional concerns. The challenge was denied, and the footage was ruled admissible in its entirety. What the jury heard over the course of that presentation was McAtasney, in his own voice and without apparent emotional weight, describing the strangulation of a childhood friend, the duration, the mechanics, and the financial disappointment of the lockbox. The recording provided what no quantity of circumstantial evidence alone could have replicated: a self-generated first-person account of a premeditated killing, delivered by the person who committed it to a man who was capturing every word. He was convicted of first-degree murder. McAtasney was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was the maximum available under the first-degree murder conviction and reflected the premeditated nature of the crime as established by the hidden camera recording. His roommate and co-conspirator, Preston Taylor, convicted in connection with transporting Stern's body and assisting in the staging of a false suicide scene, received a sentence of 38 years. McAtasney is currently incarcerated in New Jersey State Prison. He is approximately 27 years old. Under the terms of his sentence, parole is not a legal possibility at any point in his lifetime. The case has been discussed in investigative and legal contexts as a demonstration of the value of proactive sting operations in homicide investigations where physical evidence alone might not support a conviction. Sarah Stern was 19 years old. The inheritance her mother had left her, the money she had no reason to hide from someone she had trusted her entire life, contained $7,000 when McAtasney finally opened it. He noted that discrepancy on the recording. He remembered the figure. He reported it as a disappointment. That detail is in the court record, and it is, in the simplest terms, the documented accounting of what Sarah Stern's life was worth to the person who had known her longest. Case number 4. Santi and Kenneth. Chimes. The notebooks were meticulous. Entry by entry, they laid out what the Chimeses intended to do. The forged deed, the false name. Kenneth was living inside the victim's own home. The specific steps required to transfer $7 million Manhattan property into Santi's name, and, threaded throughout, the name Irene alongside items to be handled. They were written by hand, maintained continuously over the course of the operation, and recovered from the car at the moment of arrest. They were not incidental to the prosecution. In a case that went to trial without a recovered body, the notebooks were the case. A murder conspiracy recorded by the people who designed and executed it, produced as evidence before Irene Silverman's remains were ever found. Santa Chimes was 64 years old and had been a criminal for the majority of her adult life. Her record stretched across decades and included convictions for fur theft and large-scale fraud, as well as a federal conviction for enslaving undocumented domestic workers, holding women in a state of involuntary servitude in a scheme that had resulted in federal charges and a prior term of imprisonment. Her son, Kenneth Chimes Jr., was 23. He had been raised inside his mother's criminal operations and had been functioning as her instrument and enforcer for years. Together they had identified Irene Silverman, an 82-year-old widow, who owned and operated a five-story boarding house at 20 East 65th Street in Manhattan, valued at approximately $7 million. The plan was to forge a property deed transferring the mansion to Sante. To execute it, Kenneth obtained a room in the house under the false name Manny Guerin and began an extended interior access operation inside Silverman's own home. Irene Silverman had lived a rich and varied life before the Kimmises arrived in it. She had been a Rockette dancer, had worked as a showgirl, and had married a successful businessman who had since died. Widowed and independently capable, she had run her Manhattan boarding house for years and was regarded by those who knew her as sharp, alert, and attentive to her surroundings. When the tenant, calling himself Manny Guerin, began to behave irregularly, appearing in areas of the house he had no reason to access, displaying a pattern of behavior that did not match his stated presence there, Silverman began keeping written notes of her own observations. She had begun the formal process of having him removed. She did not have the time she needed. On July the 5th, 1998, Kenneth Kimes strangled Irene Silverman inside her home at 20 East 65th Street. Her body was disposed of in a location that has never been identified. No remains have been recovered in the more than 25 years that have passed since her death. The same afternoon, the Kimeses were stopped and arrested at a street location in New York City on an unrelated outstanding Florida warrant. What began as a routine pickup on a prior legal matter became something else entirely when police searched their vehicle. In their possession, Irene Silverman's house keys, her passport, her personal notarized documents, a loaded 9mm handgun, and the notebooks. The notebooks contained the murder conspiracy in explicit operational language, Silverman's name written alongside action items, the mechanics of the forged property transfer, disposal logistics, and entries in Sante's handwriting that left no ambiguity about what had been planned and carried out. Silverman's own personal effects, including identification documents she would not have willingly surrendered, were in the car of the two people who had been living in her home and who could not account for her whereabouts. What had begun as an arrest on a Florida warrant became, within hours, a murder investigation. The case against the Kimeses was not assembled gradually from scattered investigative threads. It was present in documentary form inside a single vehicle, stopped on a Manhattan street on the afternoon Irene Silverman disappeared. The trial was held in New York in 2000. It was notable for proceeding without a body, a no-body murder conviction that was unusual in New York at the time, and that required the jury to find both defendants guilty on the strength of documentary evidence and circumstantial proof alone. The prosecution relied on the notebooks as its primary exhibit, supported by the forged property documents, Kenneth's established false identity, Silverman's belongings in the Kimeses' possession, and testimony from members of Silverman's household staff who described the suspicious behavior of Manny Guerin in the days before her disappearance. Both Sante and Kenneth Kimes were convicted of murder, robbery, and conspiracy. Sante Kimes received 120 years. Kenneth Kimes received 125 years. Kenneth subsequently confessed to the Silverman murder and to the 1998 killing of Las Vegas businessman David Kasdan, offering those confessions in exchange for legal considerations in a separate California proceeding. Sante Kimes died in the Central California Women's Facility on May 19, 2014. She was 79 years old. The cause of death was a stroke. She died in custody, having served 14 years of the 120-year sentence imposed in 2000. Kenneth Kimes remains incarcerated and is approximately 50 years old. Irene Silverman's body has never been recovered. The notebooks that documented her murder, page by page in Sante's handwriting, are a matter of public court record. The people convicted of killing her have been sentenced. One has since died in custody, more than 25 years after the crime. The notebooks covered the planning in extraordinary operational detail. What they did not record, what was not written down among all that meticulous preparation, was where Irene Silverman was put. That information has not been found. It remains the one fact about this case that the notebooks did not contain. Case number 5. Robert Durst. He walked into a bathroom still wearing a microphone. The final interview of the documentary had just concluded. Robert Durst believed he was alone. What he then said, quietly, to himself, in a private moment he did not understand, was being captured on a live audio feed. Was later introduced at his murder trial and played for the jury. The words were, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." That statement, spoken without apparent awareness of the recording equipment he was still wearing, became the most consequential piece of self-incriminating audio evidence the case produced. The question it opens is not only what he meant by "killed them all," it is how a man who had avoided formal accountability for the better part of 3 decades arrived at a bathroom in a documentary crew's facility with a forgotten wireless microphone, saying out loud what he had never admitted in a courtroom. Robert Allen Durst was 57 years old in December 2000. He was the heir to the Durst Organization, one of New York City's prominent real estate companies, and had spent years living at a considerable remove from the expectations that wealth and family might have established for him. Eccentric, reclusive, estranged from his relatives, and possessed of a demonstrated capacity to survive circumstances that had not, until very late in his life, resulted in criminal conviction. His first wife, Kathy, had vanished in 1982. New York investigators had reopened that matter across the following decades without producing charges against him. In 2001, the dismembered body of his neighbor, Morris Black, was found in Galveston Bay, Texas, where Durst had been living incognito in a rooming house, posing as a mute woman. He was arrested, admitted to dismembering Black's body, and claimed the killing had been an act of self-defense. A Texas jury acquitted him in 2003. By December 2000, he had survived 2 of these situations. When New York authorities once again reopened the investigation into Kathy Durst's disappearance and contacted Susan Berman to request an interview, Durst made a decision about what to do. Susan Berman was 55 years old, a writer and journalist who was the daughter of Las Vegas organized crime figure Davy Berman. She and Robert Durst had been close friends since their time as students together at UCLA, a friendship that had endured for decades and that had led Berman, in the years following Kathy Durst's disappearance, to speak publicly in Durst's defense on more than one occasion. She was among the people who had known him longest and defended him most consistently. When New York investigators contacted her in December 2000 to request a formal interview about what she knew, she was killed before she could give one. On December 23, 2000, Durst traveled to Berman's home at 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive in Beverly Hills, California, and shot her in the back of the head. Berman's body was discovered by a friend on December 24th. Before the discovery, an anonymous note had been mailed to Beverly Hills police, directing them to Berman's address and containing only the word cadaver below it. The note had been sent by Durst. At trial, prosecutors established through handwriting, comparison and analysis of distinctive spelling errors that the cadaver note matched patterns in Durst's known correspondence. The case was opened, documented, and then went cold. For over a decade, no charges were filed. The investigation that finally produced a prosecution was a documentary. In 2015, HBO broadcast The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, a 6-part series for which Durst had agreed to be interviewed. The filmmakers had obtained a letter written by Durst in his own handwriting that matched, in structure and in specific idiosyncratic spelling, the anonymous cadaver note sent to Beverly Hills police 15 years earlier. They confronted Durst with the letter during a final interview. Between that interview and the next, Durst left the room and entered a bathroom without removing the wireless microphone the production had affixed to him. What the live feed captured was transmitted to the production's audio monitoring and subsequently included in the documentary's final episode. On March 14, 2015, the day before that episode was scheduled to air, Durst was arrested at the JW Marriott Hotel in New Orleans. In his possession at the time of arrest, a latex mask, a fraudulent identification document, and $42,000 in cash. The trial was delayed by Durst's deteriorating health and then by the COVID-19 pandemic. It did not reach conclusion until September 2021. The prosecution's case was structured around three evidentiary pillars: the handwriting and spelling analysis that linked Durst to the cadaver note, the bathroom audio captured during the documentary, and testimony establishing the precise chronological relationship between New York investigators' contact with Berman and her death, the framework that made silencing her the logical explanation for what Durst had done. On September 17, 2021, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. On October 14, 2021, Durst was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died at the Marin County Detention Facility on January 10, 2022. He was 78 years old. The cause was complications from COVID-19 and congestive heart failure. He died approximately 3 months after his sentencing, having spent the greater part of 4 decades avoiding formal accountability before a wireless microphone he had forgotten he was wearing ended that run. Susan Berman was 55 years old. She had spent years publicly defending Robert Durst, standing behind him through the disappearance of his wife and through the Texas acquittal. The prosecution argued that she died because she knew what had happened to Kathy Durst, whose body, like Berman's, has never been found, and that her impending interview with investigators represented a risk Durst was not willing to take. She was his most loyal friend. The conviction that finally came for him rested in part on what she had been about to say the week she was killed. Case number 6. Sarah Williams. She brought flowers, chrysanthemums, purchased and delivered by hand to Sadie Hartley's home in Helmshore, Lancashire, several weeks before the murder. Sarah Williams stood at the front door long enough to assess the entry point, the distance from the street, the positioning of the threshold, the sightlines from the road. Then she drove away. The delivery was logged in Katrina Walsh's diary as a reconnaissance visit, a pretext constructed around a floral arrangement so that Williams could physically evaluate an approach to a house she had already decided to return to with different intent. The chrysanthemums were not a gesture. They were preparation for what Walsh and Williams had been planning for the better part of 18 months. Sarah Williams was 35 years old, a travel agent working in England. She had previously been in a romantic relationship with a man named Ian Johnston. That relationship had ended, and Johnston had moved into a relationship with Sadie Hartley, a transition that Williams responded to not with acceptance, but with a fixation that intensified over the following years rather than diminishing. What Williams communicated to her friend Katrina Walsh about this fixation, across meetings and conversations that began in roughly mid-2014 and continued through early 2016, formed the foundation of a conspiracy that Walsh did not merely witness and keep quiet about. Walsh, 55, was an active participant. She engaged with the planning. She accompanied Williams on surveillance activities. She researched and helped source the weapon, and she maintained a written diary from the conspiracy's beginning through its execution and its immediate aftermath, recording it in her own hand with a thoroughness and chronological consistency that would eventually make it the single most damaging prosecution exhibit in the case against either of them. Sadie Hartley was 60 years old. She was a medical communications director, professionally established, in a stable and committed relationship with Ian Johnston. She had not provoked Williams or inserted herself into Williams's prior relationship. She had not done anything to bring that sustained campaign upon herself. She was simply the person Ian Johnston was with, and in Williams's assessment, that fact alone made her a problem to be eliminated. On the evening of January 14th, 2016, Hartley opened her front door. Williams had traveled to Hartley's home in Helmshore that night. When Hartley opened the door, Williams used a 500,000-volt stun gun to incapacitate her at the threshold and then stabbed her approximately 40 times. Hartley died inside her home. The planning that had led to this moment had been extensive and documented. The acquisition of the stun gun and research into its effectiveness, repeated surveillance of Hartley's daily routines, and the schedule she kept, the chrysanthemum delivery, to assess the physical approach to the house and contingency planning for what Williams would do in the aftermath. Walsh's diary had recorded each of these stages in real time as they were happening across the full 18 months of preparation. Police traced Williams's vehicle through CCTV footage taken in the area surrounding Hartley's home. Both women were arrested within days of the murder. When investigators located Walsh's diary, the evidentiary situation changed fundamentally. What had been a case built on circumstantial and forensic evidence became, in prosecutorial terms, a self-documented conspiracy. The diary covered the initial decision to proceed, the weapon research and acquisition, the surveillance operations and their findings, the flower delivery and its purpose, the night of the attack, and the steps taken in the cleanup. It was maintained throughout. Walsh had recorded all of it. The entire arc of the conspiracy was present in her own handwriting, in chronological order, from beginning to end. At trial in Preston Crown Court in 2016, Walsh's diary served as the prosecution's central exhibit and determined the shape of the proceedings from the outset. The diary did not describe a crime of passion or a momentary breakdown in judgment. It described an extended, deliberate operation, a specific target, a specific weapon procured and tested, a documented method of approach, evaluated through a prior visit to the victim's door, and a timeline that had been running for more than a year. The defense had no credible answer to a document maintained in Walsh's own handwriting, in real time, across the full duration of the conspiracy. The entries were not ambiguous and they were not isolated. They were continuous, chronological, and internally consistent. The record of a sustained decision to kill a specific person, maintained by one of the people who carried it out. Both women were convicted of murder on the strength of a diary that one of them had written and kept. Williams received a life sentence with a minimum term of 30 years. Walsh received a life sentence with a minimum term of 25 years. Appeals seeking reduction of those minimum terms were filed and denied. Both remain incarcerated. Williams is approximately 44 years old. Walsh is approximately 63. The terms each of them is serving extend well beyond the age at which the crime was committed. Sadie Hartley was 60 years old. She had spent decades building a professional career and a personal life. She was killed because she was with a man another woman had decided she should not be with, killed by someone who brought her flowers as a cover for assessing how to reach her, whose companion kept a written record of every step in the plan to end her life. Walsh's diary ensured that the account of what was done to Sadie Hartley would outlast any attempt to obscure or minimize it. The record exists in the planner's own language, from start to finish, in Katrina Walsh's handwriting. Case number 7, Rachel Wade. The voicemail is part of the official court record, in her own voice on a recording that was preserved, cataloged, and played for a jury in 2010. Rachel Wade said, "I'm going to murder you. I'm going to stab you." It was not the first message of its kind. She had left similar recordings over the preceding months, a documented pattern of escalating hostility that had moved through phone calls, voicemails, and social media exchanges, each exchange more specific than the one before it. What distinguishes the final message from the earlier ones is not the language, but the chronology. Wade left that recording, and then she did what the recording said she was going to do, in the precise manner she had described. Rachel Wade was 19 years old, a waitress living in Pinellas Park, Florida. She had been in an ongoing conflict with Sarah Ludeman for the better part of a year, a feud that had grown out of competition over a shared romantic interest named Joshua Camacho, and had moved, through social media exchanges and voicemail records, from general hostility to direct and explicit threats. The recordings that police would later compile spanned months of this escalation, documenting the progression in Wade's own voice. The language had grown less ambiguous over time, moving from general hostility through insulting language to something more operationally specific. Multiple recordings were recovered and cataloged. They formed a timeline of a conflict that had been moving toward a violent conclusion for long enough that its arc, in retrospect, was visible to anyone examining the record. The final message Wade left for Ludeman was not a threat in the rhetorical sense. It stated, without elaboration, exactly what she intended to do and how she intended to do it. It was a statement of fact delivered in advance. Sarah Ludeman was 18 years old. She lived in the same area, had been involved in the same conflict, and had exchanged hostile communications with Wade across the same period. On the evening of April 14th, 2009, she arrived at a residential street in Pinellas Park in a car with friends. She stepped out of the vehicle. Wade had armed herself with a kitchen knife before arriving at that location. She was positioned and waiting when Ludeman's car arrived. Witnesses later described the encounter not as a mutual confrontation between two people who happened to be at the same place at the same time, but as a targeted interception, Wade moving toward Ludeman at the moment she stepped from the vehicle with a knife already in hand. She stabbed Ludeman once in the chest. The blade entered the heart. Ludeman died at the scene. Wade crossed to a neighboring property and threw the knife over a fence before emergency services arrived. When officers reached her and took her initial statement, she claimed that the stabbing had been an act of self-defense, that the confrontation had been initiated by Ludeman, and that she had acted in response to a threat. The self-defense account did not survive examination. Police retrieved the knife from the property where it had been thrown, confirming it as the weapon. They also compiled and reviewed the months of voicemail and recorded communications, which documented in Wade's own voice and language a progressive pattern of explicit stated intent that stretched back through the months before the stabbing. Those recordings did not describe someone who had been placed in a position of danger and reacted to it. They described someone who had made a decision, stated it repeatedly, and then carried it out. Witness accounts from people present at the scene that evening described an ambush. Wade had arrived first, had been waiting, and had moved first with a weapon already drawn. The recordings, the physical evidence, and the witness testimony converged on the same conclusion. Wade had said what she intended to do, had obtained a weapon in advance, had positioned herself to carry it out, and had done so. The self-defense framing had no evidentiary foundation to stand on. At trial in 2010, the prosecution played the voicemail recordings for the jury, establishing the documented prior intent through Wade's own statements. The combination of the audio record and the physical and testimonial evidence eliminated any reading of the stabbing as a spontaneous act of self-protection. The jury convicted her of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years in Florida State Prison. An appeal filed in 2012 was reviewed and subsequently denied. Wade is currently incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida. She is approximately 35 years old. Lowell is the primary women's correctional facility in the state. Under the terms of her 2010 sentencing, accounting for applicable good time calculations, she is projected to serve into the late 2030s before becoming eligible for release. Sarah Ludeman was 18 years old. In the years following her death, her parents, Jeff and Gay Ludeman, became public advocates, speaking about their daughter and about what they had come to understand about the gap between documented verbal threats and the institutional response to those threats before violence follows. They testified in venues about the need for that gap to be taken more seriously. They have continued to speak publicly about Sarah and about what her case represents. Not a spontaneous outbreak of teenage violence, but a documented escalation that produced a recorded prediction and then delivered on it. Sarah Ludeman had her entire life in front of her. The person who ended it had told her, on a preserved recording that exists in the court record, that she was going to, and then armed herself with a knife, waited for her to arrive, and did. Case number 8. Ezra McCandless. The word carved into her arm was intended to tell one story. The physical evidence told a different one. Ezra McCandless arrived at a dairy farm in Washington County, Wisconsin, in the early hours of March 22nd, 2018, in visible distress, clothing torn and soiled, her forearm marked with the word boy, and reported that her former romantic partner, Alex Woodworth, had attacked and assaulted her on a nearby road. Emergency services responded. Police located Woodworth's body at the rural location McCandless described, with 16 stab wounds, lying in the mud. They then examined the physical evidence at the scene and on McCandless herself and found that it was inconsistent with her account in every dimension that forensic analysis could evaluate. Ezra McCandless was 20 years old. She was involved in multiple simultaneous romantic relationships and had, over the period preceding March 2018, generated ongoing interpersonal conflict as a result. Multiple witnesses who testified at trial described a documented pattern of fabricated personal emergencies, staged suicide attempts, invented abuse claims, manufactured crises that had been used in previous situations to generate sympathy, to shift the narrative in her favor, or to destabilize the accounts of people she was in conflict with. The pattern was not unfamiliar to people who knew her. It had a consistent structure, a dramatic incident, a claim of victimhood, and a series of statements that did not fully hold up under scrutiny. What she did on March 22, 2018, followed that structure. It differed from prior instances in consequence alone. Alex Woodworth was 24 years old, a local barista who had been in a previous romantic relationship with McCandless. He agreed to meet her on a secluded rural road in the town of Barton, Washington County on the evening of March 22nd. The nature of the meeting and the reason Woodworth agreed to it is not established with certainty in the court record. What is documented is that he drove to that location and that he did not return from it. On that road, McCandless stabbed Woodworth 16 times. She left him in the mud on the shoulder. She then removed a pocket knife and carved the word boy into her own forearm. She tore and dirtied her clothing to simulate the physical presentation of a person who had been attacked. She walked to the dairy farm, presented herself to the owners as a victim of violence, and told them that Woodworth had assaulted her and had been attempting to forcibly impose a male gender identity on her. She directed emergency services to Woodworth's body, which was found exactly where she said it would be, which was also the location where she had just killed him. The blood spatter pattern at the scene was inconsistent with McCandless's stated account of how the confrontation had unfolded. Forensic examination of the wounds on her forearm established that they were self-inflicted. The analysis was specific. The angle at which the cuts had been made, their depth relative to the point of entry, and the directional trajectory of each mark were, taken together, consistent only with a body position that McCandless herself could have occupied while making them, not with a position in which another person was controlling the knife. The pocket knife used to carve the word into her arm was her own, recovered from the scene. The word boy had been inscribed from an orientation that only she could have reached, given the direction and mechanics of the incisions. The staging had been carried out, but the physical record of how it had been carried out was present in the wounds themselves, in the geometry of their angles and depths, readable by forensic specialists with the appropriate training and tools. That analysis dismantled the account she had provided to first responders. Prosecutors charged McCandless with first-degree intentional homicide. At trial in 2019, McCandless testified in her own defense. Her account of what had occurred on the road shifted during cross-examination in ways that directly contradicted the statements she had made to investigators and first responders in the immediate aftermath of the incident. Multiple witnesses testified to her documented prior history of fabricated emergencies and the pattern those fabrications had followed across multiple prior situations. Medical experts provided forensic testimony establishing that the wounds on her arm were definitively self-inflicted. The jury declined to credit her account. She was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide. McCandless was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years. She is currently incarcerated at Taycheedah Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. She is approximately 27 years old. Under the terms of her sentence, her first parole eligibility falls approximately in the year 2069. Her legal team has continued to pursue post-conviction relief based on alleged procedural irregularities in the trial. Those efforts have not, to date, produced a reversal or modification of her conviction or sentence. Alex Woodworth was 24 years old. He went to meet someone he had been in a relationship with on a rural road where no one else was present, and he did not come back from it. The evidence McCandless had staged at the scene, the carved word, the torn clothing, The distressed presentation at the dairy farm was designed to replace the actual account of what had occurred there with a different narrative, one in which she was the victim of a violent assault and Woodworth the aggressor. Forensic analysis dismantled that replacement at the level of physics, at the level of angle and depth and trajectory. The word carved into her arm told the story she wanted told. The direction of the cuts, examined by specialists who could read them, told the one that was true.